Good morning, welcome to this webinar today. Do let me know if you can't hear me or anything like that. Um, Today's webinar is all about fonts and typography. You might have lots of experience, you might have very little experience, and you're looking to pick up some tips. Chances are you know more than you think. So let's get started on this webinar. Just wanted to introduce myself properly before we start. So I'm Matt, I'm a visual design lead here at Totra, and I work on marketing projects for the company and also on content and materials for the community, the Totra community. And I'm a designer and illustrator, and I've worked on lots of branding and e-learning projects in the past for various brands like ice cream brands and communication firms. Here at Totra, we're always producing lots and lots of different materials for the academy and the community, from animations to PDFs to leaflets. To touch on a bit of housekeeping, today I hopefully shouldn't be speaking for longer than 40 minutes, roughly. If you've got a question, do ask using the chat function in Zoom, and we're going to pause at the end of each section, and if some good questions have come up, we'll have a look at those. Otherwise, we can talk through any questions you may have at the very end as well. So the purpose of today's webinar is to help you with some ideas on how you can make your typography more effective, like the title of the webinar says. So in part one, we're going to go through what we mean when we talk about typography. And then in part two, we'll quickly dip into a little bit of history and some of the terms used to describe typography and lettering and letter forms. And then in part three, we're going to apply it all. So we can see what you can do day to day to help your communication with typography. And hopefully, as a result of this webinar, you'll be a lot more confident in doing so, in going about that. So please note that this webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it back. If you miss a bit, have to leave the room, or there's anything you want to go over. If you are watching this webinar via our community webinars on demand, hello from the past. But yeah, this reminder of that the webinar is being recorded is more a reminder to me than anyone else. So part one, typography, typography 101. It sounds quite scary as a word, doesn't it? Typography. Ooh, it's a bit like mission control, quite intimidating as a word. Sounds very technical, quite difficult, quite specialist, but it does not have to be this way. It is simply using fonts with the written word. And it's like everything, really. The more familiar you get with it, the easier it becomes. So that's the intention of this webinar, to get you more familiar, and then hopefully you'll try more things as a result. So here's the definition from a well-known crowdsourced online encyclopedia you might have heard of. Take a second just to read that and see what you think. I think the important bits here are that it's legible, readable, I mean, same thing really, and that it's appealing as well. It sounds good, but sadly typography can seem a bit inaccessible at times. Going back to what I was saying about mission control and it being very daunting. People use all these unfamiliar terms and scientific sounding words, and that can really put people off. One of those words, in fact, is typeface. That's a word sometimes you hear designers or people who are really into fonts use. So starting with that as one of these terms, a typeface is basically a font. There is a difference between a typeface and a font, but don't think that if people use the word typeface that they're some sort of magician. So the difference really is that a font is what you have on your computer. It's a collection of the characters or glyphs. There's another inaccessible term for you. So it's a collection of the characters in the design of that typeface. So you have Times New Roman on your computer. It's a digital font of the letters in the Times New Roman typeface. Throughout this webinar, I'm not going to get hung up on the terminology. I'm not going to correct myself if I say typeface instead of font. I'm not going to nitpick like that. But in a nutshell, the terminology is as so. The typeface is the design of the letters, and the font is the delivery system. A really good analogy I heard recently was that if you think about downloading music, MP3s, a typeface is the song, the lyrics and the music, whereas the font is the MP3. So talking about fonts, where do we see fonts? I think we see fonts absolutely everywhere. We see them in use everywhere. I'm sitting in quite a plain room right now, but I can see them on the TV remote, on the front of a book that's in the corner of the room, on my clothes, on the wall. And that's just passively looking around the room. If I wanted to actively do something like get a bus or open an app or write a document, read a newspaper, cross the road, try to find the toilet in a restaurant, I would be interacting with a font. If you think about it, you can probably name quite a bunch of fonts off the top of your head. So here's 12 fonts that are quite common. Like I say, they're common ones. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good. Are they good? Am I the right person to be the judge of that? We will get to that. So bear that in mind. You've all probably faced that drop-down menu in Microsoft Word and wondered which one you should be using. You've probably dreaded this decision. Maybe you've put it off till you've written a few paragraphs first and then decided, what font should I be setting this in? I don't know if anyone else has noticed, but a lot of fonts start with the letter A, don't they? Probably because the people who made them want them to get seen at the top of that menu. There are some fonts that you see every day, and lots of them are used consistently on purpose. Like here in the UK, we've got the NHS. Here's some visuals from the NHS's brand guidelines that are available online. The NHS use a typeface called Frutiger, designed by Adrian Frutiger, who died a few years ago. So they use Frutiger in all their materials, including important information like locations, or that there isn't an A&E department there, so you have to go to the nearest one, which is in the Queen Alexandra in Cobham. They want to always be using this same tone of voice. They want to be seen as a trusted source. You wouldn't get that scrawled in hand lettering if it was from the NHS, because they're using it for important information like locations and wayfinding, and quite serious information as well if you're undergoing certain treatments, I imagine. So here in the UK, we have a typeface that was designed specifically to be used on road signs in the UK. It was designed by Jock Kinnear and Margaret Calvert as part of the redesign of the whole road sign system here in the UK. I think it was in the early 60s. I drive, and people rely on these signs all of the time to find out where they're going, to make sure they're in the right lane, to make sure they're not breaking any rules, adhering to the highway code here in the UK. So people rely on this typeface to tell them information every day and to tell it to them clearly. So when it was being designed, it was tested for legibility. It was actually put up, it was shortlisted against another typeface designed by someone else. And they did tests by getting people to stand and look at it from very far away. And they put it on a car and made it run towards them and said, well, which one is more legible? And this font, Transport Medium, as it's called, that was designed by Jock Kinnear and Margaret Calvert, that won in the end. That got chosen after A/B testing like that. In the US, there's a similar typeface. I think it's called Highway Gothic, or often it's referred to as Interstate, that they use on their signs. And in Germany, for example, there's a typeface called DIN, which stands for Deutsch into something standardization. So it's not just a kind of odd case that the UK has its own typeface for the road signs. So imagine if we weren't using that font for the road signs. Imagine if all the road signs was in lots of different fonts. Imagine if it was in some sort of death metal band font, a distorted, grungy, medieval black letter font like this that's all been broken up into pieces. Do you think it'd be easier to read? Do you think it'd be more suitable, perhaps not as suitable? It might be more suitable if you're on your way to a Dropkick Murphys gig or something like that, perhaps not if you're on the way to a business meeting. You might not be able to see where you're going as well. So why do people try and use their fonts consistently, like the NHS, like the UK road signs? It's all about the tone of voice that's conveyed by that typeface. The reader can subliminally recognize them without necessarily thinking, acknowledging them. By just reading the text, you can tell what kind of message it's trying to get across. So here we've got an NHS leaflet as an example. It's a poster for one of their campaigns. It's also taken from the brand guidelines website that I cited earlier. At first glance, the headline kind of looks the same as lots of other fonts, but it's sans serif and it's modern. But when you look at the font that they always use, you kind of end up relying on this familiarity. Subliminally, you can kind of go, oh, I recognize that, but without doing it, acknowledging it out loud like that. You could almost remove the logo in the top right-hand corner of this leaflet, and you'd kind of get the idea that it's still the NHS talking. The blue and the font itself are almost enough to say this is the NHS's tone of voice. So corporations have latched onto this way of using fonts as a tone of voice. Lots of brands have their own fonts designed. For example, in the top left here, we have IBM's typeface. It's a couple of years old. Bottom left, that's a typeface that was designed by Neville Brody and his team of associates for Channel 4 TV, the TV channel here in the UK. And on the right, we see the Netflix typefaces there as well. So even companies like McDonald's have their own typeface now. They're bespoke, they're just for them. So they're slightly different. And it means that there are less copyright issues at times, but also that they're talking this unique tone of voice. So these companies are making sure they always use that font because they've invested money in them and they know that it's going to pay off with their audience. So whether bespoke or a chosen existing typeface, these brands are subtly speaking in their tone of voice and they're subliminally recognizable as the brand without necessarily showing the logo. So here at Totara, we use Open Sans. It's a freely available font. You can get it on Google Fonts, for example. It's open source like our product. So that's one of the things that we like about it. We don't have our own bespoke font, but we ensure we always use the same one consistently. So we're talking in our Totara brand of tone of voice. We create, one of the reasons we do use Open Sans is we create materials that are often translated into different languages. And Open Sans has all the Roman language glyphs in light and bold and italic, etc. So if something has to be in Hungarian, then we can do that, no problem. We don't get missing letters and things like that. We don't have to put umlauts on top of things. And it's free as well. So if one of our Totara partners is creating something based on our files, then they don't need to purchase an expensive font that might cost them £100 per person, because often you can end up spending about £100 per machine the font is installed on. Google did a kind of a similar typeface to Open Sans more recently called Noto, which was an abbreviation of no tofu. Because I don't know if you've ever tried this before, but when you try and do a certain character in a font that it doesn't have that character, you get this kind of portrait rectangular outline appear, and people likened it to a piece of tofu, kind of nondescript, not much going on. So they've now made this typeface that's got every single glyph that could ever be used in every language, in every alphabet, Cyrillic, Korean, whatever. And that's a typeface they're continuing to work on. So do look that up if that sounds interesting to you. There was a quick documentary on it that I found. So these fonts communicate. So that's why you can probably guess what my favorite TV show is. You can probably guess what airline I'm thinking of right now, or you might be able to imagine what my favorite soft drink is. I'm cheating a bit with the color styling there, but you understand what I mean, that these fonts are communicating to you what they are, what these things are that I'm talking about, what I'm getting across. So that is what I'm talking about when I talk about typography. Does anyone have any questions about typography? Because that's the end of that first section. I was going to open up the floor to my colleague Matt Lineker, who's here, who's been manning the chat. And I wondered if we had any questions just now.
I don't have any questions at the moment.
Okay, no questions at the moment. That's a good sign. That's great.
Everyone's very comfortable.
Wonderful. Great. Let's see if we have any more questions or any questions at all at the end of part 2. As we move into part 2, history and terminology, a little bit of history about typography, and what better way to mark that this is a section about history than by showing a sepia photo of a white British bearded old man. But this isn't a webinar about history. It's a webinar about how you can use fonts better. So we're not going to delve too deep into history. It's not a lesson as such. We're also not going to go completely mad on terminology used in typography, as we've only got limited time, and there'll be a little bit of suggested reading at the end if there's something that you like the sound of and you'd like to find out more. But I suggest taking a look at this website, thinkingwithtype.com. It's a great resource website, all about typographic details. So if you'd like to learn more about letter forms specifically, this is really good. Like we've got things like the ascender and descender, and the finial and the ligature and the counter. I could go on. Do have a look. What is important to know is that where typography and fonts came from, typography is the written word essentially. So lettering styles came about when people started writing the words down, and then slowly they were uniformalized. They became kind of more uniform as lettering. So if we know how things came about, we may know more about how to mess around with them, how to push them and break the rules with a bit of grace and a little bit of style. Here at the top of this slide, we've got some pieces of work by Jan Tischold, who designed lots of publications in the last century. He's seen as a kind of classic typographer and designer. He designed the Penguin book covers, he designed typefaces as well. And at the bottom here, we've got a 90s magazine designer, like a well-known graphic designer called David Carson, who was always pushing desktop publishing on computers and in Letraset, pushing legibility as well. I chose to show these two designers because they're quintessentially always the examples that are rolled out of two different designers that are quite different. And yeah, I admit that they were from slightly different times, but they were generally doing the same thing, laying out type, using typography to get a message across. So the choices they made about how they treated the type, you can see they had different effects, different results. Some of these are magazine layouts here. That one in the bottom in the center, David Carson said that the article was so boring that he laid it out in dingbats. You've probably seen that font that you go past and go, what's this? And it's all odd characters. But he said it was so boring that he just thought, let's lay out in dingbats, and someone could work out what it meant if they really wanted to. So if it's Roman carvings like this, circa about 113 AD, or perhaps it's a monastic monks writing out the Bible by hand in the 15th century, they had to standardize what they did. So here we've got some kind of black letter going on, quite Gothic looking, that all have been done, and all these Bibles were done by hand, so they all had to learn how to write the same way. Equally, the stonemason carving out these letters here with the little bits at the end, the little serifs, they all had to learn how to do it the same way. So they were standardizing what the lettering looked like. And that all changed big time when the printing press appeared. So text was laid out using little bits of metal. Each letter was made out of one piece of metal, a letterpress piece. And really that's where you get the term font from, because each piece of metal was cast from molten metal. Like the word fondue has the same word etymology, because it was font, it was founded. It was melted and then formed and then made into this little piece with a letter at the end, the wrong way around. You'd apply ink to that and then print it on the paper. So you could reproduce hundreds and thousands of pieces of paper with the same text on. So these standardizations meant that later companies could always use the same font and have fonts designed for them. The London Underground had a typeface designed for them just before World War I by a guy called Edward Johnston. And it's still in use today. It's admittedly been digitized and tweaked ever so slightly for things like legibility of very, very small sizes. And it's had things done like they've made an extra bold version and an extra light, thin version. But here on the left, you can see the original designs that were used to devise the typeface, to devise the way the letters looked. And then on the right, we've got a photo of them in use in the last few years on the Piccadilly line. So they were used, the typeface was used on Harry Beck's Tube map, for example, as well, one of the most famous maps in the world. So even though it's been redrawn a little bit, it's still in existence. It's still essentially the same font. And in addition to letterpress that we saw earlier, things like Letraset became available in the 20th century, meaning people could choose typefaces without having to have whole trays of metal type and a whole kind of type foundry to do it. And other methods like photo setting came about. And then it all changed when desktop publishing came about. Here's an image of PageMaker, which was one of the first desktop publishing programs that you could have on a computer and lay out text and add imagery and really choose which font you were doing it in. People were able to control type on their computer now. And then you have things like Microsoft Publisher and Quark and InDesign. And InDesign is one that a lot of us use today when we're designing things up. And you can do lots of things in Microsoft Word that you couldn't do in Microsoft Word 10 years ago as well. It's really all come on. So onto terminology now. There are lots of terms that people throw around when they're trying to make out that they work in mission control as a graphic designer. And here are a few that you, I think, should be aware of, the ones that maybe you should be more worried about than any of the others. At the top here, we've got serif and sans serif. So you can see Times New Roman there at the top left. That's a perfect example of a serif typeface. So a serif typeface has these little feet headers at the ends of long length. So you see it on the T, either edge of the T and at the bottom of the T. And that's come along from when people were carving stone, and that's how they'd end the letter. That's how they'd end a stretch of a letter like that. And then in the middle, we've got a sans serif example. Arial bold is probably one that everyone's familiar with. It's on Microsoft Word. You see it, it's up the top, up with the A's, where you start looking at typefaces. That's a sans serif, so that means it's much cleaner, much more modern, and doesn't look like something that's been carved into a building. And along the bottom, we've got three terms that are used a lot that you can very easily do on any desktop publishing software: bold, italic, and then all caps, which means writing it all in capitals. Or sometimes people say uppercase as well. Weirdly, because when the letters were in letterpress drawers, they kept them in drawers. They had two cases, an uppercase and a lowercase, as in a wooden drawer full of letters, and all the capitals were kept in the uppercase. So that's why it's called uppercase, and lowercase, all the small letters that you'd get mid-sentence are kept in lowercase. So we'll go through a few more terms now. We're just going to whiz through them. Don't worry, there's not a test at the end or anything like that. This one, leading, here we've got, you can change the leading on a paragraph of text, and the leading is the amount of space between each line. Perhaps in the past when you were studying, you had to submit a manuscript or you had to submit an essay, and you might have got tutors and lecturers asking you to double space the lines like this. You'd be adding leading like this, so you've got a lot more white space. You're not cramming the text tightly into the page. It helps to think about your reader's eyes if they've got to read pages and pages. So in Microsoft Word and in PowerPoint, this is called line spacing. So you can see on the left, we've got something that's tightly leaded, and on the right, we've got something that's, you could say, is generously leaded, or it's got generous leading. It's called leading because when we were doing this in letterpress, people would get lengths of lead and put them in between the lines of text. Kerning is another word that refers to the changing the space between individual letters. So you might want to tighten the space between an uppercase serif K here in the not kerned section and the lowercase e, so that the e kind of sits a little bit closer to the K, so you don't get this big wide space between the K and the e. You might just want to apply it there, though, not across the whole word or the whole sentence. And that can really vary for different fonts, whether they need to be kerned or not. If this is something that you're interested in doing to some of your big titles, perhaps in Microsoft Word or in Microsoft PowerPoint, what you can do is hit Command D or Control D if you're on a PC. And then at the top here, you'll get this menu appear, this box, this window. And in the top there, if you hit Advanced, the one that's selected blue, you can then change kerning for font, which is part of the way down there. Don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but there. And in Microsoft PowerPoint, you hit Apple T or Command T or Control T, and you'll get a similar menu come up as well. So don't think that all these different things that I'm showing you are only for people who have Adobe Creative Cloud and only know InDesign intricately and intimately. You can do some of these things, quite a lot of these things, in Microsoft Word and PowerPoint as well. So next up is something called tracking, which is very similar to kerning, but it's kerning applied across a whole paragraph or line in a uniform way. So before with kerning, we were just looking at the spacing between two letters. We're looking at all the spacing across the whole line now. So here you can see it's tightly tracked on the top, and then at the bottom it's nice and widely tracked. That might give you this more kind of classical feel. I'm not sure what sort of thing you'd be going for, but you get a lot of widely tracked words in fashion, for example. Like if you look at the Chanel logo, you could park a bus between the letters The space between the letters is huge. So in Microsoft Word, it's referred to as spacing. And again, you can access it the same way we did previously. One of the second or third options down there is called spacing. You can change that from normal to widely spaced, tightly spaced. When you read about typography or you're talking about typography, you might come across the word baseline. So the baseline is the line that the text, the type sits on. Here I've made it pink for you to see. You don't normally see it like that. It's invisible, but you can change whether the text sits on the baseline, or if it's raised, or if it's perhaps superscript or subscript. You know, like when you write carbon dioxide, CO2, the 2 is normally subscript, or if you've got 10 to the power of 3, the 3 you would change it to superscript. And there are buttons that you can do this with do this to your letters in Microsoft Word and PowerPoint nice and easily. And the next thing I was going to show you was X height. So people talk about the X height of a font. And the X height is the height of a lowercase x in that typeface. So these 2 pink lines show the space that is the X height. And people often refer to the X height of a font as in, it has a very high X height for a serif font. So it would mean that the difference between the lowercase x and the uppercase capital might be a lot less. So the text might look a lot more stout, a lot shorter, a lot thicker. It might mean everything looks very big, but every typeface is different, so do have a look and see what you think about it. So that brings us to the end of our kind of quick run through some terminology there. Did anyone have any questions on typography history or terminology? Maybe there's a term you've heard and would like to know more about.
So Richard just asked one question. Just wanted to know if there's any theory on why Gutenberg's original font used a serif. Was it to mimic handwriting? And then, as part of that as well, is there best practice for when to use a serif or sans serif, or is it just personal taste?
It could be personal taste, but generally when you're reading lots of text smaller, like a kind of the body of a novel, you would generally use a serif font because it's easier to recognize the letter forms, I'd say. It's rare that you come across a novel, a book that's in a sans serif typeface. I'm not sure about, Rich had a question about Gutenberg, that the Roman lettering was kind of quite in style at that time. So he was using it then for that reason, I think. Were there any other questions, Matt, at this stage?
Those are the questions so far.
Okay, great.
Satisfied as well.
Excellent. Sorry, who's satisfied?
Everyone's very satisfied.
Great to hear. Okay, fab. Well, we'll press on then to part 3, putting it all together. So we've covered some typography background. We've looked at the history and the terminology used. We've also seen some examples of it in use as well earlier, like the NHS and Netflix Sans. So now it's time to talk about how you could put it all into action. On this title card here, you can see jumps over the lazy dog. This is something that you see in typography quite a lot. The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog, or a lazy dog, is an example of a pangram, which is a sentence that includes all the letters, all 26 letters of the Roman alphabet. So often you see fonts displayed that way, so you get an idea of what they look like. So a good tip is if you're looking at choosing a typeface for a title or for a certain word, for a logo maybe, do try and look at the word that you're laying out in that typeface, not just a pangram, because you might never be using the L and the Z, for example. So do look at the text that you're going to be setting it in. So here is the big question that I imagine a lot of you signed up to this webinar for. What font should I use? This is the daily struggle of the graphic designer. What font should I use? How do you decide which font you should be using? Well, the best thing to keep in mind is essentially suitability. What are you trying to get across? What would be most suitable? If you look at these 5 or so fonts that I've got on the screen here, look at each one and think, what do they make you think of? And is it something good or something bad? Are there good connotations to it? And you'll probably all have quite different connotations and quite different opinions on them. So it's not necessarily whether it's good or bad, it's about whether it's suitable. So if I was doing a comic or something like that, perhaps the typeface at the bottom would be most suitable. If I was laying out a novel, like we were speaking earlier about in response to Rich's question, perhaps the font in the middle there, the serif font, might be more suitable. If I was doing some sort of logo that needs to look a little bit retro, maybe I'd use that typeface at the very, very top. It's quite kind of blobby, and you can imagine it's a bit 70s. So the important thing here is, yeah, is it suitable? So I found this really great example in a book by a designer, a well-known designer called Chip Kidd, in his book, A Kid's Guide to Graphic Design. I'll share details at the end, but Kidd is spelt as in his surname, not necessarily just for children. And he has this great section in there that says, which font feels like you? So he's set just the word me in lots and lots of different typefaces. And he's asking the reader to reflect, are they good or bad? Is it suitable? Which one feels like you today? On a Monday, you might feel completely different to the way you do on a Friday afternoon. I might be having a kind of quite a serif day on a Monday morning, who knows? And then on Friday afternoon, I might be like that bit of graffiti in the bottom right-hand corner, who knows? If I'm going to a party, I might use one of these, this kind of rodeo giddy up kind of typeface here. Maybe I'm going to an Art Deco party and I'm thinking like that. So it's really about what's suitable. So these typefaces, all these fonts, they communicate like a tone of voice, like we saw earlier with the NHS and the transport typeface. They're almost kind of communicating a genre in a way, like we saw with some of the typefaces in Chip Kidd's book layout there. A kind of a feel is what they're getting across. So we can use these fonts, the fonts we choose, to get the message across, essentially. Here we've got some words and phrases set in what I think is a suitable font. So I put the question to you guys, do you think that they match? Do you think that they hammer home the meaning of the word or the phrase that they're displaying? Do you think that messy looks messy? Do you think groovy looks groovy? What do you think they'd look like if they didn't match so well? What do you think it would look like if groovy was in this kind of handy, paintbrushly, messy typeface, or elegant was actually in the one that retro's in? Do you think they'd work so well, or would they confuse the reader? Aside from the little tips on MS Word that I've given you there, how can you make your communication more effective with fonts? So we've said, consider the fonts you're using, the suitability, but also consider the reader, the end user, the person that's consuming that text. You'll have all had different opinions on some of those typefaces I showed earlier. You might be laying out something that needs to look professional. The word might be right, professional, but is the styling right? That styling might be a little bit off. What your font choice is saying about your content. So here we've got a group of people there, they're seeing the word professional, they might think something along these lines. They might think that word looks outdated, that company looks outdated, they might not be up to scratch, let's use another company. Picking up on our earlier point about suitability, you're giving that writing a voice, you're dressing the word in clothes. That's one of the analogies that a lot of people use when they talk about typography. You're dressing the words, you're putting a suit and tie on them, for example. There's a really good example in a book called Stop Stealing Sheep and Find Out How Type Works. I'll give details about that at the end, where they're comparing typefaces to shoes. So it's similar to this analogy of dressing the words. I've recreated some of them here to show you an example. So I've got two fonts here that I think go quite well with these pairs of shoes here. So we've got shoes and shoes there. Are they smart or are they casual? Are they uptight or are they relaxed? Are they no nonsense or maybe they're more whimsical? Just be considerate of the subject matter, really. What do these typefaces, what do these fonts make you think of? And maybe look at them in isolation as well, not with the text alongside, the imagery alongside them. So there's other things as well that you can do to help your typography on top of what we've discussed already. When you're choosing fonts, maybe don't use too many new fonts. Here on the left, we've got lots and lots of different fonts. And then on the right, we're using much fewer and we're treating them all the same as well, consistent. So consider using 2 fonts consistently and repeatedly rather than putting the entire kitchen sink of fonts in all on one go. Another thing you can do when you're deciding how to treat your chosen fonts is use something called contrast. And by that, I mean make sure that the changes are significant. So if you've got 2 sizes, make sure that they're different enough, they're significant enough. So if you compare the items on the left, the sets of information on the left, with the sets of information on the right, the pairs of items on the right show a significant difference. We don't have type that's in 8 point and 9 point and 11 point and 13 point. We would have type that's in 8 point and 20 point, something like that, a significant difference, because we can't expect the reader to notice all these very, very small differences. We want to make it easier for them to notice a difference. So when you're thinking about how many fonts to use, what sizes to use for the titles or maybe intro paragraphs, just make sure that they're different enough to be noticeable. If you're looking for new fonts, you could always try Google Fonts, as everyone has access to it, but please don't go crazy and download hundreds of fonts and use them all in your next Word document. The reason I suggest Google Fonts is because it's, like I say, everyone's got access to it. It can be frustrating when you use a font that either isn't free and you're the only person that's bought it and you shouldn't be duplicating it, or that you can't get everywhere as well, that maybe people don't have access to. So I suggest before even looking at Google Fonts, look at what you have on your computer first. There's a set of web-safe fonts that are generally on every computer and are used as standard on the web, fonts like Tahoma and Georgia, and they're decent enough serifs and sans serifs for you to give them a try and see what works, really. I wanted to show you an example that I came across on the internet that I'm a big fan of. Someone kind of put this all to the test in a way. This website, Typeset in the Future, looks at science fiction movies and the fonts they use in the scenery, in the background, and in on-screen displays, and it challenges how they work to create this futuristic world that they're presenting, that the director has a vision of. So here's one example here, the film Moon, which is all about someone who's on a base on the moon, and you can see a little bit of text in the background there on this image here, Sarang. I think that's the name of the company that employs Sam Rockwell's character, or whatever his name is. And this website goes through all the different instances of type in the film and looks in incredible detail at what the font is and whether it's the right kind of font, if there are things on the props. You get things like red alert appearing on the screen. Is that in the same branding? Has the Sarang brand used the right brand guidelines to lay that text out? Is the killer robot actually a different brand of killer robot than the others? It's great to see an example of how font choices add to and back up and hammer home the content, just like you can do when you choose a font in the next Word document you open. So I'd suggest you do go and have a look at that if you're into science fiction films like this. Is by a gent called Dave Addy, and he's gone through lots of different films in extreme detail, and even looked at things like there was a logo on a hairdryer that is used at one point. He's going, oh, that's very futuristic. So have a look. You might say frustratedly, I don't know which font to choose. I don't know lots of fonts. Then I suggest really that you look at examples. So if you're designing a bar menu, look at the fonts that are used on a bar menu. If you're designing a leaflet that's about charities, look at other charity leaflets. How do they treat the type? What do you like about it and what don't you like about it? Consider what you think is successful and what you think will work better. Because I'm aware that lots of people kind of say, well, I don't know lots of fonts. But think back to that slide we showed earlier with about 12 different fonts. Chances are you'd seen all of those, either on Microsoft Word or on a poster somewhere. There are fonts all around us, and it's just about becoming more aware, more familiar about them. We had to do something along these lines recently, looking at an example when we went about producing a newspaper earlier this year. We looked at magazine layouts, at the conventions used for articles in a newspaper. Some of it was made easier because we already have, like I mentioned, a kind of house font that we use. We use Open Sans. but we looked at how type was treated for different parts of the articles. What was the minimum, the smallest size the font could be when being printed with newsprint? Because sometimes newsprint things can get a bit blurry. So we didn't want to go below about 6 point, for example. We had to think about things like how would the pull quotes look to make sure they were different enough to the other pieces of text on the page. We had to make sure there were multiple entry points as well, captions on photos, other little pieces leading people to the different bits of content, intro paragraphs and teasers. So whilst that's not exactly an example of choosing which typeface, it's a way that you can kind of put it into practice. So that brings us towards the end of this typography webinar today then. So here are a few things I thought would be great for you to consider as takeaways from today. And they are that typography is simply using fonts to communicate. It's no kind of mystical illusion or anything like that. It's just using fonts. So don't think that you're kind of not equipped to do it. Everyone with desktop publishing software like Microsoft Word can be involved. It's not like a kind of a closed club or anything like that. So don't be put off by those complicated terms and the notion that you need to know all of typographic history. And choosing a font is all about suitability. What's the most suitable font? Is this font communicating what you want it to say? Is it hammering home the message that you're trying to get across? And do look at examples of what you're trying to achieve. And you can always test out your font choices on colleagues, get people to say what they think it makes them think of. Does it say professional, or does it say lackluster, casual, charlatan? Who knows? You might find that you might get some odd answers, things you haven't considered. So you're always welcome to email me. My email address was at the beginning, I think, or post in the Total community. But if there were some things that really piqued your interest about typography in this webinar, and you are interested in having a bit of a read, then I'd suggest this book on the left, Stop Stealing Sheep and Find Out How Type Works. It's written by Eric Spiekermann, a designer who's designed lots of typefaces himself, like Meta and things like that. And it's got loads of typography insights and layout tips, and it goes into lots of detail gradually. So it's great as a start. And if you're interested in different typefaces, I'd seriously consider watching the film Helvetica. It's a really great documentary all about the design of this typeface. And it goes on to talk really all about visual culture and not just what this one typeface is about, but what it means to be the person that chooses a typeface, and that everyone is doing that now. I mentioned Chip Kidd's book, Go, a kid's guide to graphic design. It's really great because it's kid as in the author's name, not necessarily children, but it is kind of aimed at kids as well. And it's great to look back at basics, but then it's full of loads of advanced design tips as well. It's one of these books I return to a lot when I've got to kind of start something new. And to touch on the massive sci-fi nerd aspect I mentioned earlier, Typeset in the Future is the book that's been produced of that website, typesetinthefuture.com. So do have a look at that. It's really great to see how the Blade Runner typefaces, the Blade Runner film has all these different typefaces in it, and Alien and things like that, and how they add to the futuristic world that's being created. I've touched on some of the things that I've covered in other webinars as well. So if you're looking for more general design tips, I've got the Design Tips for Learning Design webinar that's available on Webinars One. So do have a look at those two as well. But other than that, that's the end of the webinar. So thank you very much for listening. Did anyone have any questions at all?
So a couple more questions. So Bobby's asking if there's a recommended site that you suggest to review for finding typefaces. Also, if there's a set number of fonts that should be used together on a page without causing visual chaos.
Well, in terms of visual chaos, it would be great to stick to 2, maybe maximum 3. If you're having to use more than 3, then maybe there's quite a lot going on for your viewers. There are some websites, I'm not sure of them off the top of my head, that are quite good at pairing fonts. I know that Google Fonts has a feature where if you look at one particular font, it suggests some that it would go well with. So it might suggest that you set the body copy in Lato and the headline in Railway, for example. So do have a click there and see what they say.
Okay, great, thanks, Matt. Another question. What are 2 to 3 best practices when mixing fonts? Maria's saying that she's heard about mixing serif plus sans serif, perhaps. Can any of the fonts be mixed together, or is it about preference?
Well, it is about preference, but you mentioned serif and sans serif. Generally, people are using serif fonts for body copy, and sans serif or more display typefaces for headlines and things like that. Often people try and choose typefaces that have a similar X height so they look about the same size. Because despite 2 fonts being in 12 point, one of them in 12 point might look quite small and short compared to a serif font also in 12 point. They might have different X heights. So do compare the X heights and see, you probably want to keep them in the same size if you're using them interchangeably.
Great.
Yeah.
Matthew's from Synergy's asking a question. What's your opinion on blending between your brand font and a campaign font? So header fonts for advertising materials can either be very on-brand in terms of the font or very campaign-orientated, but which is very different from the brand. Is there a best practice there?
I suppose consistency across the campaign is good. It'd be great if it was something that was quite different to your regular brand font. So you wouldn't want to use something that's very, very, very similar. If you were using Helvetica as your brand font, you wouldn't want to use another quite well-known standard sans serif as well for your campaign font, because people wouldn't notice the difference. So it could be something really significantly different. And then as long as people saw them consistently, I think that would work. It's a good question.
Great. Does anyone else have any other questions for Matt today? Matthew's also put in a website called HTTP Typo, typ.io. That's a good website for comparing fonts. So yeah, have a look at that one. If you're in the chat, you can see what Matt's put there.
Great, thanks for sharing that. Brilliant. Well, if you have any more questions, do feel free to email me or post them in the community. Thanks very much for joining us for this webinar today. I'm sure there'll be another visual design related webinar again in the future. Have a good day. Cheers.